So my daughter is about 2.5 now, and she likes to be involved in everything, especially in our kitchen. Anytime we're making something or doing the dishes. And so what I decided to do is make her a kitchen helper stool so that she could easily access the counters and be able to help us out, as well as get anything that she really needed. One requirement for this stool is that I needed to make it so that it could be broken down and stored easily in a small area. So I looked online, found a bunch of ideas, and came up with a design that I thought would suit us. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this stool, in addition to how I got all of the different angles right, and everything that you need to know to make your own kitchen helper stool. I do have build plans available online for this stool, so make sure you go and check them out. I'll link them in the description below. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. That way you'll always know when new projects like this one go up on our YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get into the build and I'll show you how I made it. So to start off, I used some maple that I had left over from a previous project. I actually had quite a bit of this maple left over, so I decided to make it out of this. I would recommend using something a little less expensive if you are making this stool, but the maple worked good for me and helped me to use up some of the stock I had. To begin, I just milled down all of the rough lumber so that I had some clean edges and everything was a uniform thickness. And then took them over to my table saw and cut them all down to the rough dimensions. So pretty much all of the stiles or bars of this stool are about 3/4 of an inch thick by 1.5 inches wide. Here I'm gluing up the panel that will make up the landing or the seat of the stool. I won't go into too much detail as far as what the dimensions are. If you would like to get all the dimensions, make sure you go and check out the build plans. They're linked in the description below, and thanks for supporting the channel. After that, I got all the rails and stiles softened with a bit of a round over on all the edges, just to make this a little bit more kid-friendly, because obviously my little daughter is the one that's going to be using it. This is super quick and easy with a router table. You could also use a trim router with a router bit. I then needed to create the circle support pieces that all of this will connect and swivel onto. I did this first by creating circles using a caliper and then setting the center of the circle with my spring-loaded nail punch. Now to actually cut these circles, I'm using this really awesome jig that I got from my dad for my bandsaw. What you do is you set a small finishing nail on the center of the circle, and then that nail just slides right into this jig and spins perfectly in a circle as your bandsaw cuts it. This jig can cut up to 32-inch diameter circles, which is pretty awesome. It's really precise and cuts really, really well. It's probably one of the best jigs that I have around my shop. I did have a little bit of shaking, but it was mainly because of my hands, so I had to go to my band sander and sand down all of the edges afterwards. Now there are a couple other ways of cutting circles. You can use a jigsaw or even a router with a circle cutting template. Once the glue was all dry for the panel, I decided to cut it all to length and make sure that the sides were even. Then I proceeded to cut all of the stiles to their length using my miter saw. Now here is where everything kind of started to get tricky. I had to figure out all the different angles and figure out how far I wanted the legs to swivel and what the lengths would be. So I kind of just put everything up and lined them up together, made sure that they were all marked correctly, and cut everything to their proper width. I also used the seat to make sure that I knew exactly where the seat would land on the side stiles. Really, this was kind of a trial by error and something that you shouldn't have to do if you download the build plans, because I'll have all of the angles and the lengths all properly marked and mapped out for you. The next thing I did was I needed to create a channel that the seat would be able to ride in so that it would be able to adjust up and down and be able to fold up. The way that I created a channel was I used this router jig that I had. It allows you to find the exact center of the thing that you're cutting into with the router bit. Now I set up some stop blocks on both sides. I went down about 1/8 of an inch into it, went all the way down to the other stop block, and then went all the way back. And then I repeated that process going down another 1/8 of an inch until I had a 3/8 of an inch deep channel. Now the front style is the one that actually has the channel in it. This style will actually pivot using the circle part and a certain bolt, and the seat or the platform will be able to slide up and back because it has a dowel that slides in that channel. The next thing I did was rounded over each of the edges using my band sander off camera, and then I attached the back style to the circle. This one will actually stay in place and will not move connected to the circle piece. I think it goes without saying, but I will say it anyways, you're actually making 2 of these. These are the side of the stool, which will allow the platform to fold up, and both sides will be connected via a bunch of dowels that act as a ladder for the kid. Here is actually where I did all of the rounding, obviously to make it more kid-friendly and just make it so that there's not tear out as this thing gets beaten up. So the next thing I did was made some holes for the swivel part of the stool. I did so by measuring how high I wanted it to be and then drilled a couple pilot holes. I obviously wanted to make sure that there wasn't any tear out on the back side of this, so I drilled pilot holes and then drilled the bigger holes using my drill press. Because this is going to have a bolt through it and it's going to be metal on wood, I wanted to make sure that it didn't wear down so much, so I put a nylon washer inside the hole to make sure that it reduced the amount of wear. And then I used that washer to mark on the leg where I needed to drill the next hole. I then marked it with my spring-loaded nail punch, drilled a couple pilot holes, and took it over to my drill press to drill the bigger holes. Now the way that this attaches to the leg is this bolt will go inside of this threaded insert. The insert will be inside of the leg, so I attached it by using a little bit of CA glue and then used the bolt to set the threaded washer inside of the leg. This is a really easy trick. You can use your ratchet set to screw it down in, let the CA glue set up a little bit, and then back it out using your ratchet. It's just a little trick that I learned. You don't have to use a screwdriver to get these threaded inserts set into where you need them to go. You can actually use the screw and a ratchet set to get it set in and flush. So the bolt is going to go through the circle part with a nylon washer that will fit in between everything to reduce any sort of friction, and then it'll be screwed into the threaded insert on the leg. Now the bolts that I had were a little long for this project, so I went and picked up some shorter ones later that weren't as long and as pointy. Next, it was time to get the seat all squared up and ready to go. So what I did is set one of the sides down on the side and marked exactly how high I wanted the seat to go. Then I marked exactly where I wanted to put a couple dowels and drilled holes for those dowels. The dowels will actually serve as a securing method to the legs and allow the seat to go up and down as the stool is folded in and out. Originally, I glued these dowels in, but I decided it's probably best to not glue them in because you can always replace them later if they get a little worn down. Next, I sanded down the face of the seat or platform and then drilled a 3/4 inch hole where the base of the platform will sit, and this platform will sit on top of a dowel. I only drilled about 1/2 inch into the rail, and then drilled a small pilot hole through to the other side of the rail. The platform will be attached to a dowel that will sit inside of this channel, and it will allow the dowel to rotate, which will allow the seat or the platform to rotate as well. I then cut the dowel to length and then tested out exactly how I was going to attach this seat to this dowel. I decided to use a couple screws that I'll drill pilot holes through the seat into the dowel and then cover up those holes with a couple of maple wood plugs. So to do this, I drilled a couple holes halfway through the platform with a Forstner bit. And then I clamped down the platform on top of the dowels so that it wouldn't move. And then pre-drilled and sunk some screws through the platform into the dowel. This made for a really secure connection, and that dowel was not going anywhere. Next, I tested out the fit on the pre-drilled holes on each of the legs, and everything seemed to work out really well. To ensure that the seat didn't go anywhere but could rotate, I screwed a couple screws into the dowel through the post and added a couple of nylon washers. Next, I plugged up the holes with those maple plugs, just added a little bit of glue, put the plugs in, and tapped them in. And then later came back with a flush trim or Japanese pole saw and chopped those things off. Once it was all sanded down, it looked really good and very seamless. Next, it was time to drill all the holes for the ladder portion of this stool. To do so, I just marked out exactly where I wanted those holes. I made sure to add a dowel that would play as support for the platform while the child or whoever is going to be standing on this is standing on it. You don't want it to only be secured by those little dowels that are running in that channel. The easy way to ensure that these holes line up for the ladder is just to tape the two legs together and drill them both at the same time. Make sure you drill from both sides to ensure that there is no tear out and that the holes look clean and crisp. Once that was all done, I had a nice looking side of a ladder, and it was time to cut all the 1-inch dowels that will play as the steps of the ladder. To do this, I used my handsaw and my miter box. To me, this is the safest way to cut dowels. If you know of a just as safe way to cut them using my miter saw or table saw, let me know. After that, I gave everything a good sanding because it was going to be really hard to sand this thing once the dowels were put in place. Once I did sand it, I glued all the dowels in place using Titebond 2 water resistant glue because this thing was going to be in the kitchen. It's really easy to put these in place, especially if those holes are all lined up. I just added a little bit of glue, tapped them all in place on one side, and then added a little bit of glue to the other side inside the holes and tapped that thing in place. I used a block to make sure that I didn't damage the outside of these poles, and then I used a spacer dowel to ensure that the ladder was wide enough apart. As you can see, I have some of the dowels that are a little proud on the outside of the ladder. That is totally fine. I will go and cut those out with a flush trim saw later. Once one was done, I added the other one, making sure to add the seat with the movable dowel on the inside of it. And then did the same process of tapping everything all together and making sure that it was evenly spaced out using my spacer dowel. Some of these dowels were a really tight fit, so I had to kind of improvise on the way that I got it all put together, but everything seemed to work out, and I just cleaned off all of the glue because glue squeeze out is a pain to sand off. And then I set the movable dowel in place with those screws and that nylon washer. Next, like I said, I used my flush trim bit to go and cut off the excess dowel from the outside of the leg, and then used my orbital sander to sand it all down and give it a nice finished look. I then added the round turn pieces back using some glue and those screws that I originally screwed into it. And then it was time to get the whole thing all put together. Really, the way that you get those dowels that run in that channel in there is you kind of just angle them in, and then they should just kind of pop together as long as your measurements were all correct and everything was put together correctly. Then to attach them to the round part, I used the bolts with the nylon washers on the front end and on the inside, and then connected those bolts using the threaded insert. And here is what the stand looks like pre-safety bar and pre-finish. To fold out, it was a little rigid to begin with, but as those dowels that run in the channel kind of wear down, it really starts to fold up and down a lot nicer. And as you can see, this thing is really sturdy. It seems to hold my fat butt even when I dance. Next, I wanted to make a safety bar that will prevent my daughter or anybody using it from falling off the back side of it. How I did this is kind of rinse and repeat from how I made the ladder. I cut some holes for the dowels on the edges of these rails. And then using the same method, I glued the two dowels into these holes, tapping them in and making sure they were to the right dimensions and the right length apart. With this one, you want to be really careful that you don't break out of the back end because the hole is so close to the edge. I actually did that and had to redo the piece. While the safety bar was drying, I pulled everything apart one last time and gave it a really good sanding using some of my power tools as well as some hand sanding. And I sanded down the safety bar to make sure that those edges don't pop out. I then laid out some painter's paper like I always do when I'm finishing any sort of project. What I decided to use was a little bit of polyurethane on the outside of this thing. I just laid out the pieces the way that I needed to, wiped them all off with a tack cloth, and then proceeded to use some Miniwax polyurethane spray. I gave this thing just a couple of coats and it really looked nice. After it was all done, it was time to get it all put back together. To get the safety bar all attached on, I added a threaded insert to the safety bar through the end of each of the dowels, and then added a nylon washer and a bolt to each side, allowing the thing to be able to rotate. And this is the finished product. It turned out looking amazing and is super functional. I mean, this thing not only will help my little daughter, but help us be able to get things that are in our cabinets that are a little higher. I'm super happy with the way it turned out. Amy, how do you like it? Oh, what are you standing on, huh? Ems. Here, should we show how this works? Look. Here, watch. Woohoo! Well, there you go. Thanks for watching the video. I'm really excited with having this stool. It'll allow my daughter to be more involved with us when we're doing things around the kitchen. If you like the stool, make sure you go check out the build plans. They're linked in the description below. They'll be on my website. If you like this build, make sure you check out the playlist that I've got queued up right here. It's got a bunch of other awesome builds that you might like. Other than that, again, thanks for watching. And like I always say, never stop creating.